Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Gallimaufry, a podcast about history. My name is Will, and joining me is my co-host Nick. How you doing today, Nick?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you. I'm actually quite excited because we've got a right stinker today, haven't we?
Oh dear, that pun was appalling. Even on our standards, that was pretty poor, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's not going to get better.
Yeah. So as we circle the bowl of season 1, why don't we hear a little audio cue to kind of get us in the mood for this episode?
As audibly pleasing as it was, it can't truly convey the nauseating nature of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to be looking at the Great Stink.
Yes, so today Nick and I are getting in touch with our inner 13-year-olds, and we'll be taking a good look at sewers.
Inner 13-year-old. Is that a normal fascination for a 13-year-old?
13-year-olds, they love bum humour, don't they? That's what they're into. I don't know. I don't know any 13-year-olds, but I remember when we were 13, we probably would have found that quite funny.
Are you suggesting that bum humour and sewers just go hand in hand? Like every civil engineer just loves a fart joke.
All I'm saying is that bum humour and sewers are the bastions of British culture. And so, shall we give a bit of background to this? Let's talk about what led up to the Great Stink.
Yes, and obviously this wasn't the fuss made at the Linnaean Society after Darwin and Wallace presented their papers on evolution. That's a pretentiously niche reference for you there. Yes,
very nice. We brought it right back down to earth after the toilet humour.
No, the Great Stink was an event so vile, so offensive that it caused a massive shift in political policy. Quite literally. It was a catalyst for basically totally revamping London's underground sewage infrastructure, which is still in operation today. But essentially, the Great Stink of 1858 was the culmination of years of sewage, waste, pollution that had been building up in the River Thames and being released in a noxious cloud of gas during what was, believe it or not, an unbelievably hot summer in England.
Yeah, could you believe it? There was a period in time when it wasn't raining in London. So by the 19th century, the sanitation in London had hardly advanced for hundreds of years. The sewer systems did exist, but they weren't really up to the job.
In fact, if we just take a step back, we can go back to the Romans who first laid clay pipes which ferried water from sort of wells into the city. Then during the medieval age, people drew water directly from the Thames itself, as well as digging wells to draw up from the ground. And gradually, over time, you get more complex systems. From 1200 onwards, you get more pipe systems using clay, sandstone, and even lead. In 1613, there was a new river actually constructed, which brought spring water from Hertfordshire to Sadler's Wells, and it's still actually in use today. And by 1845, you had just 7 companies spread across London supplying all their water.
The sewer systems did exist, but they weren't really up to the job, and problems had been mounting for some years by now. In 1700, London's population was 500,000. By the mid-19th century, it was up to 2.5 million, mainly driven by the Industrial Revolution. So you ended up with a city which was growing at a huge rate. The Industrial Revolution also brought industry to the city, and with that was the usual waste.
So for centuries, people have been dumping waste into the Thames, and whilst people have been complaining, they never really put 2 and 2 together that dumping waste into the river was going to cause a lot of bad things to happen. Most of London's sewage before the advent of a massive sewer system was actually recycled as fertiliser. So individual houses had cesspools that you mentioned. These are often just cellars underneath houses. And the solid waste, or the night soil, I don't know if you can audibly hear my quotation marks, was collected from these cellars by well-paid nightmen. They only worked at night. They were only allowed to work at night. And they transported them to market gardens, farms, all around the area, selling it to people who could use it as fertiliser. These cesspits, they weren't they weren't very well constructed, and they would seep into the ground. People forget this, but London isn't just the Thames. It's got a whole bunch of rivers that run and flow all across the city. We've just covered them over the centuries, so people forget they're actually walking over rivers. And obviously, these cesspits leaked into the Thames and into the surrounding little rivers that fed into it as well. So it's literally a problem that was building for centuries. All this waste, all this effluence was just gradually saturating the ground, leaking into the river. In fact, Samuel Pepys, who everyone loves to reference and quote because of his famous diary, he once remarked that he used to go down into his cellar, which he didn't use as a cesspit, and he would put his feet into a great heap of turds that just sort of leaked into it.
I've got to say, I love that quote. You did not expect Samuel Pepys to talk about a great lump of turd, but there we go. We can feel slightly better about the tone of this podcast now. So being a night soul hauler was quite a lucrative trade if you had the nose for it. However, by the 1840s, guano has started to be shipped in from South America, and guano is a much better fertilizer than human feces. So this hugely affected the price that the night soil haulers could sell the fertilizer to farmers for, and this kind of put a bit of a dampener on the whole industry. So we end up with a situation where cesspits aren't being emptied as they should be.
No, that's exactly right. And it was also just before the guano explosion took off. Cesspits were expensive to empty. So you had a lot of people around the city who were poor, who just couldn't afford to pay these men to come and take this crap away because, they charged quite a lot. And then guano came and it collapsed their industry entirely. Thus, you're left with all these cesspits of shit just sitting there. But before this, in 1815, there was a rule change. Before then, you couldn't flush effluents directly into the London sewers that did exist. But in 1815, there was a rule change made to allow this. And this was also partly because you had the development of the water closet, the WC, the porcelain throne, and a lot of rich people didn't want to flush this down into their cellars anymore. They wanted to flush it into the ocean. And that's exactly what happened. So you suddenly had, from 1815, a bunch of refuse sewage going directly into the Thames. In fact, this is probably one of the major catalysts that particularly historians like Halliday argue that actually turned the tide, if you'll pardon the pun, and completely pushed the Thames over breaking point. Because, in 1816, you could still catch a salmon in the Thames. But by 1820, you'd be lucky if you didn't catch something off the Thames. That's how big of a change it was.
So one of the things which really pushed the adoption of the toilet or the water closet was the Great Exhibition of 1851 at the Crystal Palace. This was one of the first times that what we would consider to be a sort of modern toilet was really exhibited to the public, and they were allowed to pay to have a go on it. So a lot of people walked away, obviously quite impressed by this, and decided to have them installed in their own houses. This tended to be rich people to begin with, but they were later in use for the poor, but usually only one for 100 people. So we can see that the poor at this time didn't really have access to flushing toilets. And this brings us to Edwin Chadwick, who was a social reformer, and he wanted to improve the health of the poor. Chadwick noted that cesspools were expensive to empty, and this was leading to cellars filling up with feculence, and the foul smells were infecting people. He campaigned to force the government to enact better water supply and drainage, leading to the 1848 Public Health Reform Act. Local authorities were given the power to appoint an officer of health, who had to be a legally qualified medical practitioner, and to improve sanitation in their area, such as collecting rubbish and building sewers, providing clean water supply. While the Public Health Act of 1848 was a great improvement on what had existed before, the system was not compulsory, and the board could not enforce councils to act on its recommendations.
One of the interesting things that Chadwick believed in, and was actually the prevailing scientific theory at the time, was that bad smells caused illness. And this stems from centuries of medicine around the four humours, which could be a topic in itself. It was called miasma theory. It was the theory that bad smells made you ill, which, when you think about it, is logical. If something smells bad, you kind of recoil and you go, oh, I don't want to smell that. Ugh. And it can make you feel a bit ill as well. But of course, this wasn't why people were getting ill. Particularly in the 19th century, there were constant outbreaks of cholera in London that killed thousands of people. And this was because the water supply was being contaminated. And also because the population was growing, there was more waste, there was more filth, ergo, more people were going to get ill. And so the first major cholera epidemic in London was around 1831 to about 1883. 6,500 people die. And then in 1848, 1849, around the time that Chadwick is really pushing to get these public health reforms through, you have another cholera epidemic, which sees around 15,000 people die. And around this time, you have a famous scientist called John Snow.
Are you saying he knew something?
This John Snow did know something, yes. Unfortunately, no one believed him. He sort of theorized that cholera was a waterborne disease. Essentially, John Snow had discovered that a pump in Broadwick Street was making people ill because it was situated too close to a cesspit, so it was sort of leaking into the well. But this theory was rejected because the prevailing theory was that bad smells made you ill, it wasn't the water. And sadly, he never really got to prove his theory was correct because he died. In fact, he died on the hottest day of this incredible heat wave, which reached temperatures of 48 degrees in the sun.
Yeah, so sadly for John Snow, it would take another 30 years for his discovery to be widely accepted by scientists. Interesting thing about him, though, he was the first anaesthetist to use ether and chloroform.
Yeah, no, he was a remarkable man, and sadly, yeah, just died before his time. Died, I guess what we consider quite young these days.
He does have quite a nice pub named after him, though.
Just yards from where the original Broadwick pump sat. But just returning to Chadwick, he was a very benevolent man, but unfortunately he was misguided by his faith in the fact that miasma was causing this. By 1849, he persuaded committees on sewer discharge to dump sewage directly into the river to combat cholera outbreaks.
So unfortunately, Chadwick, for all his good intentions, his slightly misguided belief actually led to making the issue worse. But to his credit, he did campaign for the poor and to have their conditions improved.
The commission he finally convinced to help dump the sewage into the Thames to alleviate the poor's suffering. There are actually 6 of these established between 1848 to 1857, specifically set up to look into the problem of sewage, of drainage, figure out some costs, figure out some plans. But there were so many little disputes. And part of the problem was that no one could settle on where London began and ended. In fact, the use of the word metropolis only really entered into the parlance in the 1830s. But by 1855, you had Parliament putting through the Metropolitan Local Management Bill, which basically attempted to centralise some of the aspects of administration of London, because before then it was a bit chaotic. The result of this was it also created the Metropolitan Board of Works, and one of its main duties was to, quote, to make such sewers and works they may think necessary for preventing all and any part of the sewage of the metropolis from flowing into the River Thames. And what was interesting about this committee is that the person who was appointed the chief engineer was a man called Joseph Bazalgette.
So Bazalgette is quite an interesting guy, but he's not very well known historically. His background was as an engineer, and he actually trained while working on railway projects. He later moved into working in land drainage and reclamation, which brought him to China and Ireland, and this eventually enabled him to set up his own consulting practice in 1842. Bazalgette was a notorious workaholic, to the point where he actually suffered a nervous breakdown in 1847 simply from overworking so much. He would sleep very little and he would work all throughout the day and night. It was quite common for him to come home to his house in Wimbledon gone 1 a.m. in the morning. So as Nick said, he was appointed chief engineer of the Board of Works. This was in part due to the influence of Isambard King of Brunel, who actually championed Bazalgette for the position.
And as you said, he took his duties very seriously. In fact, it was said of Bazalgette that he only liked to do two things: have children and work. So, he had quite a rich life. Ended up having 11 kids. So his poor wife. Bazalgette served on the previous sewer commissions. In fact, he was responsible for developing over 137 different proposals, including a detailed plan for a scheme of intercepting sewers. Unfortunately, as we've said, the commissions kind of squabbled amongst each other and never really got settled on what they wanted to do. And this is where the summer of 1858 comes in, because in this summer, everything changes. The problem finally has a solution.
What we have is one of the hottest summers on record at the time in London. Average temperatures were 34 to 36 degrees Celsius. There was also an extended spell of dry weather, which caused the level of the Thames to drop, leaving the raw sewage just lying on the banks.
Yes, I mean, the smell was so bad you couldn't literally walk along the river. It had been something that the local newspapers and indeed the national press had been complaining about for years, and they obviously had quite a field day. And there were lots of caricatures and cartoons sort of anthropomorphizing the river. They used to call it Dirty Old Father Thames. As with all things, nothing really ever gets changed until the richest and most powerful people have to deal with it and face the problem.
So it wasn't just the people of London who were suffering from the smell. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert actually had to cancel a pleasure cruise on the Thames and return to the shore because the smell was so terrible.
Some of the people that got quite a nose full of this new smell were the politicians, because recently they had just moved into their newly refurbished Houses of Parliament. They initially tried to disguise the smell by soaking the curtains in Parliament in lime chloride. This didn't really work. And their response was very much in the Victorian spirit of ambition and enterprise and massive self-interest to create a sanitary system of unprecedented scale and intricacy. And it cost £2.5 million, which in today's money would be about 300 million. The Thames Purification Bill was introduced on the 15th of July and passed on the 2nd of August in a record of 18 days. And the man in charge of creating this massive network of sewers was Joseph Bazalgette.
It was a huge project to take on. It was actually the biggest civil engineering project of the 19th century. It had an incredibly large budget. 22,000 labourers were recruited to dig 5 large sewers that would run west to east, parallel to the Thames, and these would then be fed by smaller sewers. So on the North Bank, sewage would be carried eastwards as far as Beckton, 8 miles east of St Paul's Cathedral, and it would then be stored and then discharged on the outgoing tide. On the South Bank, the sewage would flow as far as Crossness, 2 miles further downstream, where the same would happen. If you've ever seen Crossness Pumping Station, which was built for this, it is, as far as pumping stations go, it's quite impressive. It looks a bit like a cathedral inside.
You're absolutely right. I mean, most of the pumping stations were actually opened by royalty, and it's just weird to think about. Do you want to come and open this sewage pump station? Oh yeah, I'd love to. And some of the actual pumps were even named after members of the royal family. Imagine having to pump the Prince Albert. Just a bit weird, wouldn't it?
What an honour that would be. Albert, I think he actually was in attendance, wasn't he, when they kind of opened Crossness. I don't know how he would have felt at that time. I don't know how I'd feel.
Well, it's an honour to have anything named after yourself, I think. But yes, Bazalgette's scheme saw 165 miles of the old sewers that existed replaced, but a further 1,100 miles constructed. So as you said, it was a massive, massive excavation. Construction consumed, I think, over 300 million tons of bricks, which forced the actual price of bricks up by about 50%.
Yeah, so Bazalgette was meticulous in his planning, right down to specifying the particular bolts which should be used. And he didn't actually have to use brick. There were these prefabbed, factory-made tubes that he could have used, and they would have been cheaper and they would have been simpler. By using brick, he made sewers which were far more durable and could be tailored to suit the conditions of the land. And it's because of that that these sewers are still, in existence and working today.
He kind of had the foresight to see that, population isn't fixed, it changes and it grows. But he also accounted for extreme weather. He built the sewers to withstand extreme weather events like flooding. And as you said, they're still in use.
So in order to build these great sewers, Bazalgette had to reclaim land from the Thames. To do this, he sunk these great piles into the river, creating gaps between them, and then they would be plugged and the water pumped out. And then they could use this to build what became the Victorian Embankment. Obviously, I was aware of the Victorian Embankment, but I wasn't aware that it was built for this purpose.
No, it really is. It wasn't just Victoria. It was the Albert and the Chelsea embankments as well. In total, 52 acres of land was reclaimed. And in the process, this created new pathways and routes for people, greatly alleviating a lot of traffic that London suffered with, which, of course, is a problem that's gotten worse over the centuries. So maybe we need to reclaim a bit more of the Thames.
Yeah, maybe you should have gone all the way and just filled it in. Problem solved there.
The sewers, the single greatest thing they did was save lives. But in the process, he remapped the city as well. In fact, in an effort to improve traffic flows while these sewers were being built, he supervised the freeing of a lot of tolls on many of the bridges. If you're a labourer living in the south of the city and you wanted to travel north for work, you'd have to pay about 24 shillings a year in tolls. So you'd be paying about 2 or 3% of your wages just to get to your job. In the process of freeing up these toll bridges, he also had to replace a lot of the structures because a lot of the bridges were just badly maintained because they were owned by private companies who didn't really care. They just wanted to make money. So, Putney, Hammersmith, Battersea, he designed replacement bridges for these. In total, by the end of this massive reconstruction, some 3,000 new streets have been constructed and a bunch of old, dilapidated, run-down areas have been completely swept away.
Yeah, so this was an enormous project. Even by modern standards, this would be pretty big. I mean, compared to things like Crossrail, that's sort of nothing compared to what Bazalgette was able to achieve here.
There's actually a really nice, I say really nice, it's a nice story. In Bermondsey, there was a place called Frying Pan Alley, which was a disgusting swamp. And the people that lived there in these shoddy housings, there's a story of one tenant who had to sit at night and guard a hole in their dwelling.
This definitely sounds like Bermondsey.
The hole was basically directly over a common sewer. If they didn't sit there and guard it, all the rats would crawl up and come into the dwelling, and Bazalgette's new sewer eradicated this problem, and it rebuilt the structures in the area as well.
So by 1875, the sewage system was completed. It was expected to take 3 years, and in the end it took 18. It was arguably worth it, though. The Great Stink was over, and the cholera epidemics fell sharply.
Bazalgette's sewers directly led to the acceptance of the idea of cholera as being a waterborne thing, and basically did away with the miasma theory. By 1866, there was another cholera epidemic specifically contained within the East End, where the sewers had not been completed. Everywhere else, which had Bazalgette's sewers, people didn't get ill. So, as a direct result of the sewers, people started to take on board the idea that cholera was caused by drinking contaminated water.
Bazalgette's work was greatly appreciated by the inhabitants of London at the time, though sadly somewhat forgotten these days. He did go on to actually be knighted in 1874, and he then retired to Wimbledon, and he died in 1891.
Contemporaries at the time, and indeed historians, have labelled him perhaps probably the most influential engineer of the age, like even more so than Robert Stevenson or Brunel. And there is a monument to him on Victoria Embankment. It's right next to the Millennium Bridge, but it's quite a modest, small monument, probably reflective of the man himself.
Yes, and in July 2020, it was actually announced that a new public space west of Blackfriars Bridge, which was going to be formed following construction of the Thames Tideway scheme, was going to be named Bazalgette Embankment. Looks like he was finally going to get the recognition he deserved there.
However, while Bazalgette's scheme was groundbreaking, it didn't entirely solve the problem. It simply moved it further downriver. There was even a pleasure steamer called the Princess Alice, which sank in 1878, and over 600 people died. But many had died because they'd been poisoned by the river water. In 1887, a fleet of 6 sludge vessels were commissioned, which would take the sewage that was funneled out of the pipes that Bazalgette had constructed and dump it further out of sea to eliminate this problem. So in essence, while it did save lives, it was merely pushing the problem out of sight, out of mind.
It's interesting to note that this dumping of sludge out in the North Sea actually continued right up until 1998, which seems amazing, really, considering how our attitudes have changed over the years. But it was finally put to an end when it was effectively outlawed by the meddling EU.
Damn them.
Curse you, EU.
How dare they clean up the seas around Britain and make beaches inhabitable again.
Yes. So now the sludge is incinerated, which is
probably as environmentally bad. We still, as humans, haven't really figured out a way to deal with our problems effectively. We just sort of kick the can down the road or push it out of sight. That's an uplifting note to end on, isn't it?
It is, yes. So this is the part of the podcast where Nick and I discuss some interesting facts that we found during our research for this episode. So I think we'll start with you today, Nick. What's an interesting fact that you found?
I think my interesting fact directly relates to that exciting topic of water filtration. In 1825, complaints about the quality of London's drinking water, they were already there. People were already complaining this stuff tastes horrible. It led an engineer at the Chelsea Water Company to develop a filtration system that remains the basis of pretty much every filtration system we use today. And this was a fellow called James Simpson. He was the company's engineer, and he introduced a process through which water was filtered through a bed of sand and gravel. And it was more to ensure a clearer taste, but by filtering the water, they probably saved quite a few lives because they filtered out the bad stuff, because it was later proved that sand is actually a really good filter for getting rid of nasty stuff.
It seems to be a recurring theme with this topic, that problems get solved by accident for completely misguided reasons.
Serendipity. So, Will, what's your interesting fact?
So my interesting fact goes back to when we were discussing the lengths that Bazalgette and his engineers had to go to in order to create this sewer system. As you mentioned, many roads were dug up during the process of this. And as you can expect, this caused quite a lot of disruption, especially when it came to traffic. Records during this time show one of the first instances of the term traffic jam being used to refer to a blockage in the road that's disrupting traffic.
And I'm sure most likely the first instant of road rage.
I don't know what road rage looks like if you've got a horse and cart. I'm sure it's quite interesting. At this point, we would normally talk about a myth that we'd like to dispel about the topic. So, Nick, what is our myth for this podcast?
I guess the myth that people think about London in particularly this era and the eras preceding it, is the fact that people were quite dirty and they used to just chuck their waste and their filth right out into the street. It's that sort of enduring image of the sort of medieval woman emptying the chamber pot right into the street, or perhaps someone's cheeks perched out of the window.
So there's this sort of endearing image of sort of people with buckets and chamber pots shouting "Gardyloo" and throwing it in the street. But this is really more of a medieval image, and was really kind of out of use by Victorian times. I think it was actually outlawed.
Yeah, I mean, as early as the 14th century, there were fines for people who would throw stuff onto the street, and there would be specific officers that would come around and check that no one was doing it. And you could get fined for not keeping things clean, which is why you end up having cesspits, because you needed somewhere to throw your waste and store your waste. People just didn't chuck it out onto the street.
Right. Well, I suppose I better have a word with my neighbours then. If they're not supposed to be doing that anymore. That was our episode on the Great Stink. I hope you enjoyed it. We hope that by discussing these topics, we can get people to finally give a crap about the work of Joseph Bazalgette. Toilet jokes aside, as we draw to the end of this first season of the Gallimaufry, what are we going to be talking about in our final episode?
Well, for the finale of this series, we'll be talking about something that maybe relates to toilets. It's certainly something that enables more pleasurable moments on the toilet. We'll be talking about the invention of the printing press.
So visit our website at thegallimaufry.show. All of our podcasts are available in the usual places: Spotify, Apple, Google. But until next time, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you soon.